The Times op-ed page is really significant. And my book is the only book that discusses the origins because I interviewed John Oakes. He had the idea in 1956 because a friend of his wrote him a piece on the Suez Canal. The piece was too short for a magazine article and too long for a letters to the editor. So there's no place for it. Does anybody know what op-ed the term means?
An opposite editorial?
That is right. It's just the term that printers used when they're putting together the pages in the composing room. The big deal at the Times was we don't want to publish non-staffers. It was a turf battle. Who would supervise it? They said, well, the newsroom can't supervise opinion. So there's this big battle. Finally, Sulzberger decided, you, John, edit the page. Sulzberger insisted on a quarter-page ad. This was one of the first images. This is David Levine's image. I had a William Pfaff article putting real devastating takedown of Kissinger. I thought, well, David Levine would be great. So we have Vietnam darkening, bombs falling on Cambodia, the Shah, Chinese dragon. You have Mother and Richard tattooed on his arms. So I showed it to Charlotte. She didn't like it. I said, well, what, I could do a mid-dragon crop, and she said, it's not that, it's the excessive midsection flesh. Jean-Claude Suarez got op-ed art going. And the whole idea when op-ed started, they had to break up the gray. Two things they didn't want to do, political cartoons or photographs. Then they hired this guy, Jean-Claude Suarez. He started using Europeans and idea art. One day, he had an article on how living in New York is like living on the moon. And he thought, well, screw it. I'm not going to last. I'm leaving. They don't want me. And so I'll just put this Roland Topor drawing, which is, a guy hanging from the moon. But the editors didn't want it. They had put a photograph of New York in the page, and he destroyed the photograph cut. And the page was printed with this Topor on it. And Silverstein said, you're crazy. How could you put this in the page? And then Silverstein got a call from Harrison Salisbury, the editor, and the editor was on the phone with Punch, and Punch said, it's a wonderful page. It's just what we should have. And so Suarez was hired. Then the idea was to add something to text, to give it meaning, to give it context, to have a think piece. And so this is Absence. And this article was by a man who had just lost his wife. And it's by Jean-Michel Follon, who's Belgian. This is by Edie Vonnegut, Kurt
Hi,
Stoddard.
Jerelle.
Edie, why don't you talk about this drawing?
Yes, Jerelle was just so good to me. I'd never illustrated for anyone. I just did paintings. And doing a Madonna with a missile in her lap was right up my alley.
Well, your dad was going to write my foreword, but that was just before he died. And Ralph was kind enough to write. He wrote a fabulous foreword. We didn't want illustrations. We didn't want Norman Rockwell. We didn't want to repeat the text, and we didn't use words. This is Michael Matthias Prechtel, a German. And the article was by William Westmoreland saying that the US should have won the war. He was the big general in Vietnam War. And only illustration for the article about how the US should have won, this is Van Dong, the North Vietnamese premier, who did win. I did this with David Souter. At first, I didn't have an ad. And then an ad came on. So I had to take J. Edgar Hoover and chop him up. He's made out of spies and put his feet at the bottom. This is Jean-Jacques Sampé. This was a piece on God is no longer in control. It's science. This was a piece Anita Siegel did for a piece by Anthony Burgess. And Burgess was saying that authors should publish their own books. It gives you an idea of why editors are so squeamish. The top one was a letter about how big donors decide elections, basically. And nobody saw anything problem with it. Then we got a lot of letters, phone calls, screaming, said that there's stars of David in the bracelet and the ring. And the artist Nair Beck was a Dutch artist, and he did it with a Montgomery Ward catalog of jewelry. Then the one at the bottom is David Levine, who, after saying he would never draw for the Times again, he did, obviously, and it was about Saddam Hussein. These two were not killed. This one was killed. This was Carlos Aguirre, Peruvian artist, and this was Idi Amin. He was chopping up people with his own hand, and this didn't even have any blood. but the editors considered it too fierce. You can talk about blood, guts, rape, murder, but you can't show it. That's the power of art. Here are 3 that were killed. The first one, the top one, that thermometer, it was a very warm winter after a cold summer. And Hal Raine said it's an ejaculation. And this is Ronald Searle, Valentine, feline, going for the rat carrying a fish instead of the proper felines of her own species. And of course, Ronald Searle is this genius artist. It was killed because, why? It shows that ladies love outlaws. Bottom one was internet content should be free. Nancy Stahl did it as an idea light bulb with a copyright sign in, but Hal Raine said, we cannot publish a bare breast and a nipple in the New York Times. This is done by Horacio Cardo, who was an African-American who was denied a Medal of Honor for bravery in the Korean War. And you can't show the army as racist. This is my drawing. Karl Marx had an illegitimate son with a maid, and Engels took the rap. A lot of Marxists don't know this. And Bob Semple said, can't you make him a little less pregnant? And then when it was published, Lou Silverstein was the top design director. He said, that's vulgar and tasteless. We had an article by Daniel Yankelevich on Ted Kennedy. He was running for president in 1980, and he wasn't very well known. So I asked Andy Warhol to make a kind of a shadowy picture of him. And Charlotte said, it doesn't say enough. So I had to do it at the last minute. They left me on a Friday night. It was for the Sunday paper. I started thinking ink blot, and I did that. I signed it, Jerelle Rorschach. And the next day, Lou Silverstein said, you cannot use pseudonyms in the New York Times. This was about Ayatollah Khomeini, and Ralph Steadman showed a camel farting towards Mecca. We had an article on the Baltimore Orioles, how they were losing their name because of some ornithological reality or something. And so, but she insisted on having a picture of the actual markings of the Baltimore Orioles. So I got that done. Vivian Flesher did it. But then 2 articles came in on the Vietnam boat people. And I thought, oh, that's much more important. And we can't just have the bird. And she said, oh, yes, we have to have the bird. So what I did is I asked Vivian to draw a nest with the boat people in it. And so this is what the page ended up looking like. Here's one where I worked with Howard Goldberg, the copy editor. This is before computers, and we did the whole article as a dirigible. Al Gore did a report on the government. I gave him a B+, and some more like that. This gorgeous drawing is China and Taiwan. You see Taiwan in the middle of the island, and David made China as both a Great Wall and a dragon at the same time. Why was it killed, this gorgeous piece of art? It was too fierce. It made China look too angry. We had an article on wrestling, and this is a piece by Ben Shahn, the big famous American artist. Les Gelb said, well, that guy can't draw. Send it back. Tell him to put more lines in it. I said, well, he's not alive. And that's one of the reasons that Les Gelb had trouble with me. Saul Steinberg, by the way, hated the Times, and you can see the reason in the book. I put together 2 of his majorettes, and I put on July 4th, and he was okay with that. The chapter on Ralph is Wild Welshman Worsens. That was the watch from the guy who flew the Enola Gay. At first, they were paying for art, was paying by the column. And it was like for 1 column, you get $50, with 2 columns, $100. So Doug Floriano said he'd always make Lincoln lying down when cable came in and people were disconnecting from the networks. So he did a Medusa. There was an exhibit in the Louvre. It's called the Musée des Arts Décoratifs of op-ed art. It started in Bordeaux, and then it went to Paris. It was quite popular. But you know what? The Times didn't cover it. It was covered in all other papers all over the world. You wanted to hear my story about Nixon. Well, he called me. I did this drawing. I didn't even sign it. Nixon wrote a piece for us, and I put 2 photographs together, Nixon and Brezhnev, and I did a high contrast and stuff. So he called me. I couldn't believe it. I had demonstrated against him. He wanted the original. He said, come to my office. At the end of the long hall, there's 1 unmarked door. There's a secret knock. So I do, the door cracks open, 2 guys are on either side of the door, and one of them says, I'm the Secret Service. I was there for 2.5 hours alone. This was 9 years after he resigned. The first thing I said is that we have 2 things in common. We're both Californians and we're both Quakers, but I remained a pacifist. At which point he went into a monologue on George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, and how he was persecuted. And obviously he was identifying with George Fox. The funniest thing that happened is that I was trying to think of something positive to say to him. And so I think, oh, thank you for opening China. I was invited there on a cultural tour. And he said, well, I'm going next week. And I said, well, why don't I go with you? He took me seriously. He stared at the floor for the longest time. And he finally looked up. He said, well, Jerelle, Pat's not going. Pat was his wife.